eat.
Yeah, right.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you coming out in this busy time of year on a rainy Saturday. We have plenty of refreshments. Please help yourself. I'd like to introduce our panel here, and what format we're going to do is they're going to tell you about their totally different journeys they had to publishing. They're going to read a little excerpt from their respective books that they wrote, and then there's going to be a Q&A part. So let me introduce each of our writers. They're local writers here, right across the street, kind of.
Literally.
Patrice Gaines has been a resident of River Hills for almost 18 years. She's a longtime journalist and writer, a former Washington Post reporter, an author of 2 books, and most recently a co-author of a 3rd book. She teaches workshops on writing memoir and writing your first book. And this is Linda Worrell. She has been a resident of River Hills for 21 years. She was a journalism major but pursued a career in marketing across the U.S. and Canada. Many attempts at book writing were started and stopped until this year when Linda co-authored and self-published her first book. So, take it away, ladies.
All right. Thank you, Dina, and thank you guys for actually showing up today in this weather and everything. I really appreciate it. We both appreciate it. So, Linda and I know each other because we're neighbors. So that's great, but now also we're fellow authors, so it's just a wonderful thing. So I'll tell you a little bit about my journey, how I got to the point of writing this book. But I started out as a journalist. I actually started out as a teenager in trouble. And I took creative writing courses at places, including Central Piedmont Community College. And I found that writing helped me to express myself, and really, as I said, I didn't have to carry around the weight of my life. I could put it on paper. So that was my first introduction to the power of words. And I continued to study. I got fellowships, took creative writing courses, and a lot of self-taught, and a lot of workshops, a lot of going to hear other authors speak as well. My first book I wrote was Laughing in the Dark, which is a memoir, and I took the traditional route of publishing, so I know more about that. I'll talk a little about that, and Linda, of course, took the self-publishing route, which I'm really interested in hearing, because when I first, when this book came out, it was in 1994, and people didn't self-publish the way they do now because we didn't have the technology that allows us to do it in a less expensive way, and so that the product looks good. You can't tell now a self-published book, from a traditionally published, whereas there was a point where you could, and there was a time when bookstores very seldom took self-published books. But now all of that has changed as well. So I wrote Laughing in the Dark. When Laughing in the Dark came out, and I had an agent, and the way I got that agent was actually I knew her from journalism. She was a journalist, became an agent, and I was looking for a product, looking for clients. And I remember as a young writer thinking I had nothing to write about as far as my life, so I looked around to see who I could profile. And I kept trying to find, different people, and I'd run ideas by her, and she'd kind of go, no. And then I wrote an essay for the Washington Post about my own life. And it was really about how, as a reporter, I would go and cover all these stories about young men who were in trouble, but there were always these young women who loved them, and who would show up in the courtrooms and at the funerals. And they reminded me of myself, because I was a young woman who had dated someone who was considered a bad guy, and who I ended up beginning to do drugs. I used to shoot heroin, got busted in Charlotte, went to jail one summer, and then began the long journey to change my life. So I wrote this essay, of course, thinking I had no life really, right, to write about. There was fill a book, and my agent said, "Oh my God,
Find your book.
yeah, she's like, what are you doing?" And I was like, oh, okay. So at that time, I wrote a proposal And I got a book, How to Write a Proposal, and wrote the proposal. So a proposal included a sample chapter, and then a little summary of what each chapter was about. A little bit about marketing, how, you know, I would market it, who my audience was, what my different affiliations were that would help to sell the book. And then the agent shopped that around. So agents they have connections. So they know what editors at different publishing companies like. You know, and they've established these relationships. So they would know who would like a memoir and who would like a particular type of memoir. And believe it or not, well, in '94, there weren't a lot of black memoirs coming out during that time. And the ones that did come out were mostly about men, which tended to be, I guess, the way it is anyway. Let's change. So, anyway, she shopped it around, and because there was more interest than, well, more than one publishing company was interested. First, a publishing company that was interested made an offer, and it was more money than I made in a year, so I was like, yes. And she said, well, no, let's see, because they had some suggestions for changes. And the changes weren't things that were things that I did not mind, because, you know, some of you might go, well, I'm not going to change that. But there were things that I could understand, how that could make it better. So she said to me, the agent said, can you make those changes? And I said, sure. And she said, well, I think if you do that, we should shop it around even more. So we had an agreement with the first company that I think that if we didn't get a better offer, we'd go with theirs. But it turned out, following her advice, because I was like I said, I was ready to take the check and just go home. But following her advice, I was able to end up with double the amount of money. And so that was what that agent did for me. And then this book, and it used to be a time where your book would come out in hardback pretty much like maybe 6 months or so. Is that Karen? Is that right? I have other authors here.
Mine is not out in paperback yet.
Well, this is the thing nowadays that's changed. It used to be almost like a formula, where after it had been out hardback, then it comes out in paperback. But that's not the case anymore. And in fact, some only come out
In
in
paperback.
paperback.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's because of self-publishing. The whole market has changed. Those traditional publishing companies had to make adjustments to the market, to, you know, seeing what people want and what people will buy. And so quite often that doesn't happen anymore. But in this case it did. I don't have a copy of that one. But then I wrote another book about when I went on tour, book tour, which is a thing that happens not as much now, but it used to be more. You would go out on a book tour because it's an expensive endeavor. The thing about agents as well is, you know, they will take 15% of whatever you get, which is fine because they're not going to take your product unless they see 15% come in. So that means they believe in your work and they're going to work hard to sell it. And if they don't sell it, they don't get anything. So there's a real incentive there. But book companies used to send you out, like I think I went on like maybe I might have even been, it was a month-long book tour. They don't give out advances like they used to, except if you're a celebrity or somebody who's already sold millions. They don't send you out on a book tour like they used to, because all of that is an investment. Now, bless you. The other thing is, it's kind of like if you're a recording artist, their investors want their money back. So once the publishing company, if they give you the advance, you don't get money until they earn back their money. And they're earning so much off of each book, and you're only earning so much off of each book. Also, they're gonna keep the record, so you're gonna trust them on how much you sold. So there's all of that to consider. So at any rate, I went on a tour with that one, and then 2 years later, I wrote a very short proposal for the second book, Moments of Grace. They trusted me because the first book sold well, so I only had to write like maybe 5-page proposal. First proposal was probably like 30 pages or something. This one I probably wrote 5 pages. And unfortunately for both of us, it didn't sell as well. But I got more money than I got for the first one. So it's a crap game for everybody, but you know. And then it came out in paperback. Missing Grace. So I was working at the Washington Post then, and I continued to work at the Post as a reporter. And stayed there for, 16 years before I retired. And left the Post and became, since that time, I have freelanced for everybody, it seems. It's for a lot of magazines and a lot of newspapers. Newspapers, being a journalist helped me in the sense that I'm used to deadlines. You have to be disciplined, you know about that. But they also, in a way, they hurt my writing. Because in a newspaper, you know, you're condensing everything. I can't tell you when I go on a story everything that happened. I can't describe everything. And so you get used to leaving all that out. And then what you have to learn when you get ready to write like a memoir or a novel or something is more about making other choices to bring the people into the scene and the room.
You gotta basically, instead of condensing everything into a little punch in information, you gotta essentially detail everything.
Right.
Basically, you can't take shortcuts.
No, you can't take shortcuts.
No
And then you gotta
words.
know just
Go
how
through that story.
just how long to do it, because you can't get all flowery. Sometimes I'll write a sentence and I'm so in love with it, and the editor just goes, that is just not gonna stay. You know, I've gone off on this in love with myself kind of sentence. So anyway, so yeah, I love editors and really believe in them because they are very important. So I'll just tell you a little bit now about how I came to write this book, which is a whole different process. And because with this book, it's Say Their Names, How Black Lives Came to Matter in America. So I was doing some freelance working for NBC, and my editor this is NBC's online coverage, and so the editor that I worked with had this idea, and it was after George Floyd was killed, and during all the protests, and he said, well, his thinking was, people will think, you know, this worldwide protest is because of this killing, and in some way, that is what sparked it, but the whole Black Lives Matter movement started before that, and that what we wanted to do was to write something that said to people, there are many, many, many reasons for this, that we have come to this place in history. And so he asked some of us reporters that worked with him if we would, you know, work on this with him. And so he had an agent that he worked with. He's written other books. And so it was his agent, and we just had to write, I just had to write a summary of what I would say in my chapter. So there were 5 of us that wrote this. My chapter is called Locking Up Black Lives, because after I went to jail that summer, eventually, when my life changed and everything, I got very interested in and began to understand a lot about who gets locked up, why they get locked up, what that does, the impact that has on you, that person, their family, their community, our society, and how other countries handle this totally differently and have less crime. They don't have the mass incarceration that we have. And I was thinking about this morning, those tend to be, and this is a bad word in America, they tend to be socialist countries, but it's because they have an attitude, it seems to me, where they think more about the community than just the individual. So their concern is that the community be safe, but how do we also handle that in a way that we could perhaps change this person so that they can contribute to the community. So this time I had to do a lot of research. Just so happened over the years, I've spoken at prisons, I've attended, conferences. So I knew a lot of this. I knew other people who were, in changing this particular part of our society. And so I was able to call upon them, interview people, look up data. I chose to focus on Philadelphia, using it and people from Philadelphia, because I found out, well, it just turned out after I chose Philadelphia, because they had received a big MacArthur grant to change the number of people who get incarcerated. Because ever since we have had prisons, we have had a disproportionate number of people of color incarcerated since the very beginning. It's never changed. Doesn't mean that there are more black people in prison number-wise, but say I think it's in North Carolina, maybe we're 13% of the population, 30% of the population in prison. So it's like that everywhere. It's always been like that. And so I look at why it's been like that. I kind of look at from the first prison in Philadelphia, and how the very first prison, the first person locked up was a black person, a black man, and how it's remained that way disproportionately all the way until today. And then I zeroed in I wanted to use individuals so you could look at their lives and kind of really, see what happens, how that impacts their lives. When I was a reporter, I was a feature writer, so it was always important to me to tell stories through telling the story of an individual person. So in this chapter, I follow the beginning of prisons in Philly. They didn't need prisons in the South for black people because they had slavery. And so it was like, okay, yeah, that had pretty much handled any kind of, if they felt you had, broken a rule, justice was handled on the plantation. And then I looked at how that eventually, when they did begin to have prisons in the South, they began to do convict leasing. So convict leasing, you could lease a person. You could lease a black person. I think it was, I don't remember, it was $12 a month. But to do whatever you want. So there's major companies like sugar companies, mining companies, where there was dangerous work or very hard, difficult work, they would lease black people to do the work. In the North, when you would lease a black person, they returned to prison that each day. In the South, you just took them and you did whatever you wanted with them. So even in more recent years, I think maybe now it's been like 8 years ago, so in Sugar Land, Texas, they uncovered a mass grave where people who had worked as leased convicts had died, including some children. And so I look at how that grew, and from that point, how we came to have the prison system that we have today. So I'm going to read just a little excerpt first of a gentleman who was incarcerated in 1908, just to give you a little idea of what that was like. And then I'll do a little excerpt from a young man who had been out of prison 3 weeks when I talked to him. So let's see. This is a story of Green Cottonham, the son of a formerly enslaved couple, arrested for vagrancy in 1908 and sentenced to 6 months hard labor. His original sentence was 3 months, but the convict was required to pay a fee to the sheriff, the judge, and other local officials. When he could not pay the $38.40, 3 months was added to his sentence. Cottonham was leased by Shelby County, Alabama, to a U.S. Steel subsidiary, where he served in shackles alongside more than 1,000 convicts digging coal with a pick in the dark and damp mines. In 5 months, Cottonham died of tuberculosis and was buried with mine debris. So that just kind of gives you an idea. And then, for the more recent, this young man, Sharif Ingram, I'm just gonna find the page. As I said, he had just gotten out, had been out for 3 weeks, and I'll just read an excerpt that kind of tells you what that's like, but also what he went in for. And one thing I don't want you to think, and we didn't want this to be like a really, where you felt so hopeless at the end of this book. In every chapter, there is information about the people who are doing the work to change this today. All people of, every color, creed, race, just all kinds of folks, and some of the successes. Sharif Ingram was 15 when he was arrested and jailed, and 38 when he came home. He has been home 3 weeks. Some people think he is doing amazingly well. He has a car and a construction job and lives in a nice Philadelphia suburb with his sister Dara. But they don't see the million little things he has to adjust to daily. On his 3rd day home, he got dressed for his family's welcome home party. Before leaving the house, he stopped in the downstairs bathroom. The last thing he did was to wash his hands. It was about 11 a.m. He and his sister returned home about 9:30 that night. His sister went into the downstairs bathroom and found the water still running from the faucet. In prison, the water is on a timer, explained Ingram, who made the same mistake several times. Now I don't leave home without checking the faucets in the kitchen and the 2 bathrooms I use, he said. People think I've made an amazing adjustment, but I have to be mindful of everything. I can't even make little mistakes other people can. A number 1 goal is to not go back or to put myself in any situation where something bad can happen. He mentions later, and I'll just read about why he went to prison, but he mentions also that how long it took him to pump gas the first time, because you know how that is, all the choices you have to make in using a debit card, and he realized he hadn't set up a password. And
He used to do that for us,
yeah, how about that? And they may have been doing it for us when he went in.
Yeah.
That's the thing, people have to adjust to so many changes that have been made that we have had time to adjust to. So this is what happened when why he went to prison. Well, one of the things to say about him, he had a lot of trauma in his life, and he really was a young kid with some maybe mental health issues, and his mom did everything she could to try to get him the help that he needed, but you know how difficult that is today, and it was even more difficult, say, 20 years ago. So he ended up dropping out of school. One of the tragic things that had happened was his best friend, like a brother, his cousin, who was his age, died in a fire, a house fire, and that was just, after that, he really had a lot of different issues. So he ends up selling drugs as a teenager and hanging out with an older crowd. One night, let's see, let me go back. I'm gonna just go to he was on the corner selling crack when he got into a dispute with a street dealer. When he stopped acquiring his cocaine from that dealer, the dealer got angry and threatened him, and one night shot at Ingram. On another night, as Ingram stood in a phone booth, he heard loud music coming down the street and turned to see the dealer's burgundy Grand Cherokee with tinted windows driving closer to him. He was shouting, "Where's my money?" Ingram recalled. He saw the window going down. Scared, he shot at the truck and ran. He was arrested 2 days later. Ingram said he pled guilty, explaining that he had shot in self-defense. The judge sentenced him to life. So the only way he was able to get out, he got life without parole, but then there's an activist named Brian Stevenson who had a case, he's a lawyer, and he went to the Supreme Court to fight to say that juveniles, young teenagers should never be sentenced without the possibility of parole. So once that happened, he was able to fight to get out. I certainly did not think I would talk this long, and I apologize.
No.
All right, thank you.
Well, I am humbled to share this panel with Patrice. She's the pro. Now you're going to hear the other side of the story, which is what happens when you're a would-be writer, someone who started sort of playing with writing around 1993. I would, in between job breaks or moves around the country, and as I said, U.S. and Canada. I was the trailing spouse, so I would have a little extra time on my hands or an idea in my head. But I never got to the finish line. I didn't know how to get to the finish
What's
line.
it like? You try writing things, and then you end up with like all of these like, I don't know, like drafts or papers or documents that just you accidentally abandon, and then you forget where the story goes. So like it's
File
just sitting there
folders.
unfinished. So
Yeah.
then when you come back to it and reread, you're like getting all invested in it, and then it just suddenly stops, and you're like, oh heck, I was supposed to finish this. That's happened to me so many times.
So many times.
Keep
I
going,
know.
keep going.
It is, exactly. You gotta keep going, but it takes some kind of trigger. And for me, the trigger was my mother and I decided to create a family cookbook. And so I wrote all these stories that accompanied each of the recipes. And we printed it through a very expensive process of going to Shutterfly or some ridiculous, it was like they had $50 per book or something. But I finished it.
But you finished it.
And I thought, okay, I guess maybe I could do this. And so the event that took place that really got me, in a position where I could do something a little bit more serious was a very dear friend of ours in our book club called the Pearly Girls, suffered a massive stroke. Barbie was paralyzed mostly on her left side and went through a very long recuperation. It was 2 years ago, almost to the day, December 11. And she's had a number of setbacks, but she's also worked extremely hard through her process. But at one point, a group of the book club went down to hang out with her and have a little picnic outdoors. And here she is, sitting in her wheelchair, paralyzed, but she's the one cracking jokes and making us laugh. And she described her process of rehabilitation as 365 days of scrambled eggs. And I said, well, that sounds like a book title. And she said, well, I'd like to write a book sometime. And I said, well, I could help you do that. And it actually took a few months before we got down to work. She had some setbacks, as happens with stroke. She had a seizure. But by January of this year, we got down to work in earnest. That was a process of me interviewing her, her telling me stories. She would jot down some notes. It was a very iterative process. But the reality is, we didn't know if this was going to be a story for just friends and family or something bigger. And it wasn't until we started really pulling that story together that I think Barb really saw the potential of this story being something that other people who went through strokes and other caregivers, in particular a male caregiver, which is a fairly unusual circumstance, what they go through. So we tried a little bit harder to make it the kind of book that we could be proud of for a broader audience of folks who don't know them. So the production process was, as I said, a very iterative, but we also knew that we didn't want to take the time or didn't have the resources and connections of really talented folks like Patrice to find agents, publishers, and so on. So a friend, another author in River Hills, Maryland, suggested, how about you consider self-publishing? That's what she had done. And Amazon, the massive company that it is, had created Kindle Direct Publishing. So, free of charge,
Wow.
one can publish a paperback and an ebook and a hardcover book, which we decided not to spring for, on Kindle Direct Publishing. So that was the process we took. Because our story was going to include this really cool section that we call Tips and Quips, and she has a daughter who's a amateur illustrator, and she wanted to have a few little pictures that would occur throughout the book. we were all keen to see what that was gonna look like. So in my infinite wisdom, I decided to start putting this book together in PowerPoint. Never do that. That is not.
Let me guess, putting together stories in Keynote and PowerPoint makes it impossible to format into an actual book.
That's right. You have to format from a Word program. Exactly. So use whatever Word program you have. Forget the production process of inserting illustrations until the end. Now, at the time that we were starting in Kindle Direct Publishing, there were very few fonts available, and I had envisioned something a little bit more elaborate, but we had some restraints. I'm sure that's corrected. You know, again, they're continuing improving the process. But it also meant that we had to design our own cover, build every single page, and that all fell to me. So, as we were doing this work, I would again using the Kindle Direct publishing process. It has templates for different cover designs. So I had this vision of it having some scrambled eggs on the cover, and you know, and maybe with something that her daughter Chris, who was doing our illustrations, might be able to draw. And every time we sort of looked at it, we're like, that looks like brains or something creepy. And then somebody else said, oh, it looks like a cookbook. And so we're like, okay, let's maybe get a little more serious about this. So we used this resource that I knew from my marketing days and from other folks who were using inexpensive illustrators, a technique or a resource called Fiverr, Fiverr. Fiverr is people all over the world. Ours were in, let's see, Yugoslavia and some other country. But I hired 2 of them. And I said, here's our book blurb, as they call it. Here's our book blurb, and here's what we're trying to achieve. Here's a picture of our authors. And you know, here's one idea I had, but what can you come up with? So they began the process of, you know, throwing back some ideas to us, and the back and forth, believe it or not, let me step back a moment to say, they quote you a price up front. So for $35, you get your first iteration. So I'm looking at the 2 different illustrators, and was able to make some, you know, changes back and forth, again, free of charge, until we let one of the illustrators go, started working with one, and it was not until the day that I was literally inserting the photograph of the authors that I mistakenly blew up, and it filled the whole cover of the book. I said, that's it.
Yes.
That's the cover. So we asked our illustrator to just simply, you know, work a little bit with the fonts, finish that up, get it properly laid out for Kindle Direct Publishing, you know, have the proper space for our barcode and so on, and that became our cover.
So basically, an accidental oopsie in making a picture big became your cover.
Became our cover. Yeah. So you know,
love that.
it was a nice happenstance. Everybody felt good about it.
It's a very nice picture too.
It is.
Yeah.
It was a
it's nice.
sweet, and it speaks volumes to their relationship. They were, and I'll read to you briefly. But I do want to just also tell you one other really smart thing that we did, which was to take advantage of friends, but also contacts who were more professional writers. And so we had a set of pre-readers look at what we thought was pretty much the final thing. And we asked them to be brutally honest with us. Tell us what you like, what you don't like. I came up with a set of about 8 or 10 questions. I said, could you please answer these questions for us? And the feedback that came back, especially from my professional writer friend Liz in Seattle, and my professional writer friend Lisa, who very gently sat me down over coffee one day and said, you know what, this just isn't flowing right. What we had done was to write the whole sequential process of the stroke and then their backstory. But they wanted to know the backstory as the story of the stroke was going along. that required that I had to completely start all over again, and literally did that with cards. I cut out little strips of each chapter, rearranged them, and we pieced the whole story back together in a process that required some subheads to help set the stage for a flashback, some other photos or something that would suggest we're now talking about the past, not the present. So
Like italics or
it
something?
was it took some other techniques in the design of the book or the layout of the book to allow the reader to know where you were at in the story. So that was another sort of good learning process. I was trying to think if there was anything else I was just going to quickly share with you from the learning process, but we'll get to your questions and then you'll tell me if maybe that will help you. Okay, so we have these, I was just, the other thing I was going to tell you about this whole bit about using these tips and quips and all these funny little illustrations. If you choose to do a color book, it costs about 3 times as much. And that means less revenue for you. So we were greedy and we said, oh, no, we want more money in our pocket. There are no advances in the self-publishing world. All of your expenses are out of pocket. All of your marketing is your own. So all of that, was falling into our hands. So we did make that decision, and those would be decisions that you need to make up front. Okay, so let me read just quickly to you a bit from the book. And I want to start actually with my introduction of our dear friends Barb and Bruce. I've had the good fortune to know Barb and Bruce Quiser, my co-authors, for several years, but it was not until Barb suffered a massive stroke that I really got to know them. Barb and Bruce spent precious hours with me reliving and telling the story of their experience as they look back at the 18 months of enduring the most horrific scare a couple could have imagined. According to the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, more than 795,000 people in the United States have a stroke annually, and 80% are preventable. This reality makes it even more inspiring to learn the grit and good humor the couple brought to their challenge. They've looked back at the painful, scary, positive, and even joyful parts of their experience and hope others can learn and benefit. If I've honored them well, you will come to know Barb as endlessly optimistic with a wicked sense of humor, and Bruce as a hard-driving and heart bigger than the most full-time caregivers wearing a bra. Barb inspired me to say that. We hope also that you'll enjoy the original artwork from their loving daughter, Chris, that accompanies their tips and quips. So it starts with, and each, as oftentimes you'll see in a technique and writing today, where you do have stories from one person's perspective in one chapter, or the other person's perspective in the other chapter, we ended up needing to do the same thing. So each one would start with, in this case, day 1, Barb. Then we later go to day 1, Bruce. So that's the way we dealt with it. Looking around my closet, deciding what to wear, I spotted the new spaghetti-strapped satin dress I bought for an upcoming wedding. The dress could serve double duty since tonight's guests will not be at the wedding. Pairing the outfit with my metallic heels accentuated the sheen of the dress. While it was perfect, I settled on a more practical, sparkly flat, knowing I'd be more comfortable standing. The invite did say country club casual, and it's the holidays. I'm sure the girls attending will choose the dressier definition. It was December 11, 2020, and we'd been invited to a special evening at our good friends Bob and Amore. The event featured an extravagant 7-course meal with wine pairings prepared by our country club's head chef, Josh, for 8 lucky guests. I pinched myself thinking how lucky we were to have these friends, this home, and this lifestyle. After all the holiday parties we've been attending this December, I realized the dress was a bit snug. Guess it doesn't help I've given up on following the Mediterranean diet Dr. Cook suggested. Maybe I'll just add some Spanx. Oh heck, I'll just wear a shawl and cover up the roll. For this meal, I put comfort over looks. So she goes on to explain how they're getting ready for the party. They arrive at the party. They're having this elaborate meal. We all chatted nonstop. More courses were presented: lobster, roasted duck, beef tenderloin with foie gras butter. My waistline was expanding with each course, and I congratulated myself on my good judgment not to wear shapewear.
Thanks.
The finale was a decadent 7-layer chocolate cake. After the dishes were cleared, folks were lingering at the table, finishing half-emptied bottles, still telling stories and singing along with the music. Amor and I talked, but I have no idea what was discussed, except that I told her I needed to use the restroom. This is the part of the story the book title warned you about.
Yeah.
She ends up leaning her head on her husband's shoulder, and fortunately, as she says, a friend across from her jumps up and says, "Barb, hey Barb, can you hear me?" She had heard that she had slurred her words. It is my great fortune that Kathy is not only a trusted friend, but also a registered nurse. So they called 911, and the story goes on from there. But it was truly an interesting process of doing this as a joint project, but also, you know, it's the difficulty of trying to capture someone else's voice. So they were very good at allowing me some creative license here and there. So I think we'll pause and just, yeah, let's turn it over to questions.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, you're gonna come up and, all right. I'm
Yes.
sorry, I was gonna call somebody, but you go.
Yeah.
And then we'll take the gentleman.
So, about the process of getting a book self-published, I was wondering if this has kind of inspired me to try writing a fiction novel of sorts, inspired by a series of games that I've kind of gone into the fandom of. But the catch is I don't really know how to 100% write a story with an original plot line while keeping the cast original, so that I don't have Sega's lawyers knocking on my door because I include Sonic and Tails in my story. And I don't have permission.
Well, you know what? You don't have to, so you don't, Dina, did her question pick up on the, yeah, so she had a question about, yeah, whether or not, her concern is about the legalities of, you know, if she writes about real people, but it's fiction. So the thing is, I always tell people, don't let that stop your creativity. Do the writing first, don't edit yourself. Because in every book, you should have it lawyered. So after it's finished, a lawyer will look at it, who is used to looking at, and you may have a different answer, but a lawyer will look at it to see if, you know, there's anybody who could sue you for anything you said. And then if there is, like when I wrote my memoir, and you know, I had real folks, there were some people, and I had changed everybody's name. There were some people, I had to change their description of what they looked like. So even fewer people could recognize them. And back then, at least, what the law was regarding that was, it was okay if the people who already knew this about them knew, but if it allowed other people to know, be able to identify them and say, oh, she's the one, then it couldn't be that way. So sometimes, you know, I had to change what they were like. But don't worry about it yet. Write it first.
Yeah, write it
All
first,
right,
exactly.
I'm gonna let somebody else ask another question, okay?
I'm gonna just quickly,
Oh, you got it.
let me just quickly answer also from a self-publishing. I served as
more
my,
recent.
yeah, I served as my own lawyer. So I did actually, make sure that everyone I was mentioning in the book, those people who were present at the party and so on, were all aware that I was going to be using their name in the book. We used the title of a couple of songs. We used the lyrics from one song. So I had to seek the permission for the rights to use those from those song publishers. And so when you use a title of a song, that's permissible. But when you use the lyrics, you've got to seek the permission. So it's things like that. Yeah.
So I have more questions to ask and stuff like that, and a little personal thing. silly. I don't know if I probably should just walk off and.
Well, we might be able to talk to you afterwards.
Yeah.
Let somebody
Is that
else
okay?
ask
Yes,
a question.
I'm gonna go now.
And thank you. It's clear that you're
Good
writing.
that you are writing, so that's
So that's
fantastic.
a good thing.
I think we've got a few other writers here too. I know Mark's an aspiring writer.
My question revolved around something that I have already run into, where I use the term vomiting on the page. I'll just start writing and then I'll go back later and well, you can't say that, or this didn't make any sense. But I was more than halfway into my second book when it dawned on me that I was losing interest fast because everything was cookie cutter. And your statement was that you intermingle events.
Yeah.
And my question to you is, how did you go about intermingling your events so that it wasn't, you watch a movie, say, and the movie jumps from this time period to this time period, and
What
after
happened?
5 or 6 times of that, you're lost.
Yeah.
And then you lose interest. How did you intermingle?
Yeah, you definitely need to help your reader out, by either being very clear that, give the date. Here's this date versus that, so we know we're now 20 years earlier, 100 years earlier, whatever,
Mhm.
right? So that's one technique. There's also as we did, doing the shifting of, who the, perspective of each chapter is. I use subtitles. That was another way that I sort of, gave the trigger that I was shifting from one sort of topic area into a related topic area, but you're now gonna hear a little bit different sort of approach to what I've just been talking about. So
So
those were a
you
couple
set it
things.
up a little bit.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, help the reader out. So I think that reading it out loud is really, really helpful. Definitely read it to somebody else and just ask them to say, what did you just understand? Don't, sort of prompt them. Let them tell it back to you and see if they understood.
I can't add much, except I was gonna say, you mentioned about having a reader, and I think that's very important. Like my sister back there is, my reader, because she's very honest, and you know what I'm saying? And a reader doesn't have to know writing techniques, cause you're writing for people who read.
People would read.
Yeah, you're not just writing for teachers or writers. And so what she can do for me is say, oh, on page 21 it starts getting a little boring, or I think you shifted time here and I'm lost. And then it's up to me to go back and figure out what it is that's wrong, but she's a good reader in that sense. So.
Did you both have like one reader, or did you have several beta readers to look over your?
We have about 10.
That's a lot of reading.
Yeah.
Oh,
It was.
but you were
I mean,
dealing with
So
real
this was
people.
my co-authors
Yeah.
chose their set of pre-readers.
Yeah.
I had 3. They had,
Right.
like 6 or 8. So.
I like keeping it small. So I'll usually have 2, but the thing is, like, I'm working on something now, and so one of my readers is an agent who's interested, and so you're talking about somebody brutally honest. I can really understand about the whole rewriting. I've probably been working on this 4 years or more, so I'm almost finished, I think. But I'm getting to a point where I think if I'm satisfied, and if I can get a couple of readers who really can stay with the story, then I'll go the route. I'll be calling my friend Linda, giving advice. Say, who'd you use from Fiverr to do your cover?
How, do you need a patent before you present to an agent? How do you begin with an agent, a trusted agent? Where do you go?
Well, one of the things you can do is, when you look at a book that was published traditionally, people always thank their their agents in the middle when they have acknowledgments. You can find out who the agent is, because if you don't thank your agent, it's like you're burning a bridge. So you can always look at that agent. Nowadays, it's so easy also to just Google that agent and see. Usually, their site will tell you whether or not they're taking manuscripts, whether or not, or just what, you know.
Genre.
Yeah,
know,
what
what genre
genre
they
they like, what they don't like. You can also look up, like, if you know your genre, so say like memoir, I could look up, you know, the 10 top memoirs of 2022, and I could see who the agents were for that or something, or I could look up, whatever. But the thing is, a lot of times you end up with an agent because someone knew an agent who knew an agent, and a lot of that goes on. There was something else I wanted to say about the question. Oh,
Well, I was gonna say, we're patent.
Patent, would
Oh,
you,
yeah, that was,
would you
yeah.
get, would you
No,
get
you
a
can.
patent?
Well, I was gonna say, that was, we did seek a copyright for our book.
Copyright,
Yeah, so I filed for a copyright. It was one of our biggest expenses, actually. It's $150.
But I thought it was automatically copyrighted once you write it and put it out in
Well,
public.
and see, I don't know about the self-publishers, so with an agent, when you talk about, an agent, if an agent was to steal your work, they're never gonna work again. Word spreads.
Okay.
So most of the time, I mean, people, and if they're on the internet and they usually will tell you who they represented, as well as you can ask people, well, who's your agent, and go like that. But usually, agents list all the people they represented, and they would not represent that many people. And especially if they've had books come out this year, they still have a good reputation.
And these all apply to whether it's children's books or adult books?
You could look up agents who represent, for children's books, you could look that up. You could look at children's books. If you have some children's books that are similar to a children's book you're writing, you might look to see who the agent were on those books, because maybe they like a certain type. But you can Google them and then it'll also tell you.
That's helpful, thank you.
Yeah. That's the next one I'm working on, children's book.
I have one that I did.
Yay.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I don't know where to
And you
begin.
know who are your best friends too when you were writing children's books is librarians.
Yes.
Because
All right, then.
librarians, they know what books do, like if it's for a certain age, well, what's popular now with the 13-year-olds, or what's popular with the 5-year-old, so they can tell you what are the most checked out books this year on the, I mean, there's all kinds of information. you
I've
can
read
get from
more children's books in the last year than I have in my entire life. Yeah,
Some
I mean,
of them are
you do
so
have
good.
to.
Some of them are better than adult.
Yeah,
Right.
they were really fantastic, but it, never, shortchange a child by not working as hard on the book as you would on a.
It's
Oh, no,
amazing.
and you wanna have a point to it.
Yeah.
Something beneficial that they can learn from as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
It's
a lot of
amazing what-
responsibility
It
writing
is.
children.
I was
Yeah.
gonna say,
Yeah.
they're quite demanding, those children.
Yeah, I know.
It has
This
to
may
be
never happen, but
And
we'll see.
honest.
very honest, and the subjects that they deal with now, of course, are so much more different than the subjects our little children's book, see Jane run. Now Jane's doing a lot more. Who's she running from? Where's she running to?
Yeah, and Dick may not have anything to do with it.
May not at all. It could be another Jane, but that's another story.
There you go.
All right. Other
Be Mary
questions? Yeah. Questions? All right. We could actually
Finish on time.
finish on time.
Thank you
Thank you
all.
so much.
Thank
You wanna say how people can get your book too?
Oh,
Is it
parking
on?
lot. Actually,
That's right.
I do have some with me if you're interested. We actually just, believe it or not, we're having tomorrow the launch party that was scheduled to have taken place in August, but some health setbacks by our caregiver in that case required that we set the party back. But we just lowered the price for gift giving and for just a recognition of the launch party. So we lowered the paperback price to $9.99. And
So you can do that when you
ebook is
self-publish.
$4.99.
And
I
you
can-
can keep up with your money.
I can literally, any day of the week, I can go in and I can change the book.
Yeah.
I can change the price. I can see exactly where my sales are. I
Yeah.
don't know who bought them, but I know what country they're in. I know, how many sales I made on any day of the week since the day the book was published. I mean,
See, I don't know
it's fascinating.
that.
Interesting.
Yeah,
So you're printing on demand?
yes,
Okay.
correct.
um,
Yeah, that's the way Kindle does it.
And
And I
yours-
have noticed, by
It's
the
a
way,
wonderful thing.
that they're a little sloppy with margins, like this was
Yeah,
not
that's
supposed to
very
be
different
that
than mine.
tight.
Yeah, see?
Yeah, see that,
Yeah.
so, that's what happens, quite frankly. It's not a perfect size.
So you have an e-book version, and then you have the paperback version, is that?
Yes.
And see, I have to order my book from the publisher, and I still have to pay.
Yeah.
I get the author price.
Yeah, we get an author price. for it.
Right, but I'm sure your author price is better than my author price. But mine's about half, it's about half, but I have to pay for the shipping as well, so.
They
And I
really
don't
get you on
know,
the shipping.
Oh,
my
really?
God.
and I don't know how much, mine sells all the time. I get a report like, I think it's once a year, could be every 6 months, do you know?
Twice a year.
Twice a year, every 6 months. Cause I thought the other day I said every year, and I think it's, every 6 months. But, and then there's the thing of who's keeping the count here of that? So, there's who's keeping the count for yourself. So there's pros and cons for both. All right. I think we're really done now.
Yeah.